I'd like to introduce the first keynote, which is Ambassador Chantel Wong, who is the US Executive Director for the Asian Development Bank. Ambassador Wong has had a long and distinguished career in public service. She was nominated to be in her current role by President Biden and subsequently confirmed by the US Senate. Previously, Wong also served in the Obama administration as Vice President for Administration and Finance, and she was Chief Financial Officer at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Ambassador Wong, welcome.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, panelists, and distinguished guests. Thank you, Tom Xing, for the kind introduction and invitation to deliver this keynote address. I'm eager to speak about the net zero transition in Southeast Asia and more broadly in the Asia Pacific. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has called climate change the biggest long-term threat the world faces. The risks continue to grow. As highlighted in the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, report issued last April, the IPCC report is both a dire warning and an urgent call to action. Reducing the carbon intensity of economic activity is such an important issue, and it concerns all actors: governments, communities, businesses, investors, NGOs, nonprofits, and development partners, including the multilateral development banks, or the MDBs. These stakeholders must collaborate to accelerate the transition towards net zero. Let me begin by setting the stage. Asia and the Pacific have many of the most natural disaster-prone countries in the world, including my current home, the Philippines. Countries in the region are 4 times more likely than those in Africa and 25 more times likely than countries in Europe and North America to experience disasters. And the frequency and severity of these disasters is only increasing, destroying livelihoods, causing tens of billions of dollars in damages, and setting back economic and social development. It is almost cliche to say that the battle against climate change will be won or lost in Asia, but it is true. And Southeast Asia will play a major role in this fight. Juxtaposed against the region's vulnerability is the high reliance on fossil fuels, especially coal. Coal accounts for about half of Southeast Asia's electricity generation, and fossil fuels altogether make up about 75%. Steady and robust economic growth has been a boon, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty over the decades and improving living standards. This growth is forecast to continue. But with this growth comes increased electricity demand and more activity in greenhouse gas-emitting sectors such as transportation, agriculture, and industry. It is imperative to set up efforts to green the region's economies and to get to net zero by 2050 to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. 8 of Southeast Asia's 10 countries have pledged to achieve net zero by 2050, in line with the 1.5 degree scenario. Indonesia's current target is for 2060, and the Philippines has not made a commitment yet. We need to see more ambitious commitments, especially from Indonesia and the Philippines. But the commitments are not enough. There has to be follow-through and credible roadmaps to guide implementation and align incentives. Pledges must be formalized in policy documents, codified in law, and then integrated into legal, regulatory, and policy frameworks. A few countries, like Vietnam and Thailand, has taken positive steps recently. Both submitted the second updates to their Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs, last November. Thailand advanced its target for carbon neutrality from 2065 to 2050 and announced more ambitious mitigation targets. Vietnam also increased its mitigation targets, and in July 2022 approved a national climate change strategy. At the G20 summit in Bali in November, Indonesia and a group of international partners, jointly led by the United States and Japan, announced a Just Energy Transition Partnership, or we call it JETP. The JETP seeks to mobilize an initial $20 billion in financing to help phase out coal and invest in renewable energy, with the goal of reaching net zero in the power sector by 2050. While these efforts still need to go further to be 1.5 degree aligned, it is important to recognize and applaud such progress. These steps signify that there is political will to address the climate change. However, governments cannot do it alone. They need financial, policy, technical help from partners like the MDBs. The Asian Development Bank, where I represent the United States on the board of directors, and the sister MDBs have the mandate, the resources, the convening power, and the expertise required to support mitigation and adaptation activities. ADB, under the strong leadership of President Masa Asakawa, is positioning itself as the region's climate bank. At COP26, ADB increased its climate finance commitment from $80 billion to $100 billion over the period 2019 to 2030. A third of this will finance adaptation, and two-thirds will go towards mitigation. ADB is also fully committed to aligning its financing flows with the Paris Agreement. By July of this year, all sovereign operations will be aligned, and the target for full alignment of non-sovereign operations is in 2025. This means that all ADB investments will be consistent with development pathways that are compatible with the targets of the Paris Agreement. The ambition to be a climate bank extends well beyond this. I am proud that ADB is one of the most innovative institutions in the global development architecture. ADB is not just coming up with new and creative ideas, it is putting them into practice. For example, ADB and ASEAN governments established the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility, or the ACGF, in 2019. ACGF accelerates the development of green infrastructure in ASEAN by providing technical assistance to identify and prepare bankable green infrastructure projects, as well as the financing to meet initial capital expenditure costs. Just $60 million in financing from ACGF's parent fund, the ASEAN Infrastructure Fund has mobilized another $1.8 billion from ADB and $505 million from other co-financing partners across 5 projects. ACGF is also helping scale up the issuance of green, social, sustainable, and other labeled bonds, or GSS plus bonds, in Southeast Asia. The bonds serve as an important conduit for countries to access capital from global investors interested in thematic bonds. ADB itself is an active issuer in these bond markets. Since 2015, ADB has raised about $10 billion in green bonds. In 2021, the bank successfully raised about $300 million in blue bonds to support ocean-related projects in Asia and the Pacific. ADB is also leading the way in accelerating the phase-out of coal-fired power plants. There is a growing recognition that it is not enough to simply halt the construction of new plants. We also need to incentivize the early retirement of existing, unabated coal plants, some of which have 40 years or longer of remaining operational life. In Southeast Asia in particular, the coal fleet is very young, with many plants having come online in the last 10 or 15 years. To respond to this challenge, ADB announced the Energy Transition Mechanism, or ETM, at COP26 in partnership from Indonesia and the Philippines. The ETM is a pilot that uses blended finance structures to facilitate early retirement or repurposing of coal-fired power plants to replace those electricity sources with renewable generation. ADB and the Indonesian partners recently reached a major milestone with the signing of an MOU to lay the groundwork for what would potentially be the first ETM transaction. This transaction would accelerate the retirement of Cirebon 1, a 660 megawatt coal-fired power plant in West Java. The ETM involves donor countries, financial institutions, and philanthropies. It is designed to be replicable and scalable. There are feasibilities and pre-feasibility studies at various stages of progress in other countries, as diverse as the Philippines, Vietnam, Pakistan, and Kazakhstan. I'm very excited to see this initiative unfold. The Paris Agreement is clear on the importance of a just transition. The idea that costs and benefits of the net zero transition are fairly distributed and at-risk communities receive the support they need. ADB will integrate a comprehensive approach to just transition with the ETM that provides support for affected workers, communities, and regions. ADB and Indonesian partners will assess and anticipate negative impacts, design a plan, and implement mitigation measures in line with a commitment to ensuring that benefits are shared equitably and no one is left behind. ADB's strong commitment to a just transition is not just limited to ETM. It is also reflected in key documents such as the bank's 2021 energy policy. The net zero transition can be a powerful driver of growth and sustainable development. But climate goals should also be viewed in the context of social and economic development. ADB is working closely with our member countries and with other stakeholders to develop financing and policy strategies that ensure communities share in the benefits from the shift to low-carbon, resilient economies. At COP27, ADB launched the Just Transition Support Platform. This multi-sector technical assistance platform provides support to build capacity of ADB's member countries to strategically plan, implement, and finance just transition, to manage any negative impacts, and to increase benefits from the transition to net zero. Specific areas include, but not limited to, green skills, job programs, strengthening social protection and health systems, and creating economic opportunities for women and the vulnerable. Lastly, ADB and 7 other MDBs have jointly agreed to a high-level principles for just transition that provides direction on the aims, approach, scope, scale, outcomes, and processes associated with a just transition. These principles provide clarity around how MDBs approach the social dimensions around transition to net zero and lay the basis for collaboration for other stakeholders. With that, allow me to conclude my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Wong. Now, I'd like to introduce Ms. Jacqueline Poe. She is the Managing Director of the Singapore Economic Development Board. She was appointed to that role in October 2021. She was previously Deputy Secretary at the Prime Minister's Office Strategy Group, which leads and organises the public service to develop and implement the strategic priorities of the Singapore government. Ms. Poe, welcome.
Ambassador Chantel Wong, U.S. Ambassador and Executive Director of the Asian Development Bank, Mr. Tom DeLay, Chief Executive of Carbon Trust, Ms. Tok Sin Ying, Head of Southeast Asia, Carbon Trust, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Greetings from Singapore. Thank you to all our friends at the Carbon Trust for inviting me to deliver this keynote address. The name for this event, Accelerate to Net Zero, could not be more appropriate given the pressing challenges we face today with climate change. The recent UN climate change report, published in COP27, paints a sobering picture. Global emissions are still rising, and despite some improvements in the world's expected emissions trajectory, we are still not on track to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. While Singapore contributes only around 0.1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, the other 99% affects us too, and often more seriously than it affects larger countries. For Singapore, because we are a low-lying island nation, climate change for us is an existential challenge. This is why Singapore is committed to climate action and has set ambitious goals for decarbonization. Last year, Singapore raised our climate ambition to achieve net zero by 2050. We have also enhanced our 2030 nationally determined contribution to reduce our 2030 emissions from 65 to 60 million tons after peaking these emissions earlier. To achieve our climate ambitions, we intend to raise our carbon tax from the current level of $5 per ton to $25 per ton by 2024, and then to $45 per ton by 2026, with a view to reaching between $50 to $80 a ton by 2030. This is a significant undertaking, which relies on the cooperation and ingenuity of all of our businesses, our international organizations, and government. Specific to Singapore, industry will play a crucial role in our net zero journey. In 2020, emissions associated with industry accounted for close to 60% of our national emissions. As the lead government agency responsible for industry development and sustainable economic growth, we at the Economic Development Board believe that three key tenets underpin our decarbonization journey with industry partners in the decades ahead. They can be summarized into three words: transform, create, and attract. Let me elaborate. Transform speaks to our efforts in aligning Singapore's base of industrial activities with a low-carbon future. Singapore has a sizable energy and chemicals sector, and it has contributed significantly to our economy over the decades. But in 2021, EDB launched the Sustainable Jurong Island Plan to transform Jurong Island into a sustainable energy and chemicals park. The plan is centered around two focus areas: increasing the output of sustainable products such as bio-based fuels and chemicals, and enabling sustainable production to reduce carbon emissions. Neste, for example, is a leading producer of sustainable fuels, and it's a key example of a company with whom we are working to manufacture sustainable products from Singapore. Neste's €1.5 billion investment to expand renewable fuel production capacity in Singapore will create its largest biorefinery globally. It is also critical that we partner larger manufacturers in Singapore to enable sustainable production by lowering the carbon intensity of their manufacturing operations. In fact, this is a journey that we started with some of our key partners even in the 2000s. For example, ExxonMobil improved the energy efficiency of its operations by over 25% from 2002 to 2019 through process improvements and plant upgrading. It has avoided carbon dioxide emissions equivalent to removing 600,000 cars from Singapore's roads. Going forward, we will focus on unlocking carbon abatement through low-carbon technologies such as carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or CCUS, as well as low-carbon hydrogen. We have introduced schemes to support and encourage manufacturers to reduce emissions, such as the Resource Efficiency Grant for Energy, and we intend to continue supporting corporates in their efforts to green their operations in Singapore. Our second tenet, create, speaks to the need to invest in research and development of new climate technologies, or what is now being called climate tech. It is said that many of the technologies needed to get the world to net zero are already available today. They are simply not yet cost competitive nor at the right scale. New technologies can be a valuable tool to help us overcome resource constraints and unlock greener and more sustainable solutions. To do this effectively, we need a collaborative ecosystem. The government must create a conducive environment that promotes green opportunities. The private sector must invest in emerging climate tech, and the scientific and research community have a responsibility to develop innovative solutions. This collaboration is exactly what we intended to achieve with the Carbon Capture and Utilization Translational Test Bed here in Singapore. It's an initiative led by our National Research Institute, A*STAR, supported by JTC and EDB, to develop emerging CCU technologies in partnership with companies. The government will invest in plug-and-play modular units that can enable companies to test bed a new CCU technology within weeks. This is in contrast to the 12 to 18 months currently needed by companies to build a dedicated test bedding facility from scratch. Carbon capture and utilization technologies play a very important role in Singapore's transition to a low-carbon future. So we look forward to accelerating their development in Singapore. Another key area of research that can open up decarbonization pathways for Singapore is low-carbon hydrogen. Hydrogen can complement our energy mix alongside solar and imported renewable electricity. Depending on technology and commercial developments, hydrogen could supply up to half of our power needs by the year 2050. Yet many hydrogen technologies, such as the choice of carriers to transport hydrogen molecules, are still under development, and we all know that the supply chain is still very nascent. So we think we see opportunities to invest in the R&D to unlock key technological bottlenecks so that Singapore is better equipped to import, handle, and utilize low-carbon hydrogen when that technology is ready to scale. Therefore, the government has identified hydrogen as a focal area for Phase 2 of the Low Carbon Energy Research Program, which will set aside 129 million Singapore dollars to fund innovative projects across key climate technologies such as low-carbon hydrogen and carbon capture. Now, the last tenet of our decarbonization journey is attract. Now, as corporates in the Asia-Pacific region embark on their own sustainability agenda, many of them are already seeking to build new internal capabilities or looking for external expertise in sustainability. This is a significant economic opportunity for Singapore. By attracting the right mix of global talent and innovative business, we aspire to be a carbon services hub that can support corporates to achieve their own climate goals. In recent years, we have focused on growing an ecosystem of carbon services companies that provide decarbonization expertise tailored to the Asia-Pacific context, sometimes tailored to the Southeast Asian context. These include professional and engineering services firms, of which Carbon Trust is a key example, and they provide low-carbon consultancy, accounting, and measurement, reporting, and verification services, or MRV. Today, Singapore has a small but rapidly growing carbon services industry, with more than 70 corporates, mainly from Europe and North America, all based in this city-state. As governments around the world are pressured to implement carbon pricing schemes, the emergence of the right price signals is likely to spur the growth of both compliance and voluntary carbon credit markets. Carbon markets are important as they enable much-needed finance to be channeled towards worthy emissions reduction or removal projects globally. They also enable countries like Singapore which are alternative energy disadvantaged, to access viable decarbonization pathways and reach net zero. Singapore has several advantages that makes us a favorable location for carbon services and trading firms to set up shop in this region. Firstly, we are centrally located within Southeast Asia. This region hosts 20% of the world's biodiversity, and it's rich in carbon sinks, such as peatlands and mangroves. Companies that are developing carbon projects can manage their global operations from Singapore. And on the demand side, they are able to access a large pool of regional customers that are based here. Given Singapore's established strengths in the financial services sector, carbon project developers can also easily tap into the demand from commodity traders and brokers, many of whom have established carbon trading desks in Singapore, and as well as exchanges such as Climate Impact X or CIX. We think that carbon services are poised for a very exciting period of growth, and we look forward to being the choice location where companies can seize green growth opportunities in Asia. In conclusion, we think that businesses are an integral part of Singapore's plan to combat climate change while enabling sustainable economic growth. The EDB wants to continue to partner corporates along the three tenets of transform, attract, and create in translating your decarbonization plans into reality. I thank the Carbon Trust for keeping up the pace and urgency for climate action through today's event, and I do wish everyone a very fruitful series of discussions ahead. Thank you.